$100,000. That was the price tag my fiancé of 5 years put on the table to buy my disappearance. He slid the envelope toward me without a shred of remorse, his eyes fixed on his Patek Philippe watch, a timepiece worth far more than the bribe he was offering. He said, "Sarah, you're 38. Let's be realistic. Chloe is 24, and she's carrying my heir. This money is enough for you to retire in silence. Sign the papers and get out of my sight." He looked at me with pity as if I were a bad debt that needed to be liquidated immediately. He had no idea that just 30 minutes earlier I had walked out of a clinic with my ultrasound results. I wasn't just pregnant, I was carrying twins. In the world of high finance, we call this an undisclosed variable. I didn't cry and I didn't tremble. I picked up the pen, signed the waiver to surrender all claims, and left the country that very night. Ethan and his mistress began planning their lavish wedding triumphant in the belief that money had scrubbed away the past. But they were dead wrong. Don't turn away, because what you are about to witness is not a typical case of a woman scorned. This is a financial purge. You will see how a woman treated like an expired asset used her silence and professional expertise to freeze a trader's entire empire right before his wedding bells could ring. Listen until the very end to find out why that $100,000 check was actually the death warrant for his career and how I returned it to him, with a price he could never afford to pay. My name is Sarah, and at 38, I have spent the better part of a decade as a senior wealth management advisor, navigating the complex financial oceans of high-net-worth individuals. I was built on spreadsheets, risk assessments, and the cold, hard logic of compound interest, though for 5 years I let myself believe that Ethan was the one investment that didn't require a hedge. He was a man of towering ambition and sharp suits, a high-powered executive who moved through the world with the confidence of someone who owned the air he breathed. The air in the private dining room was thick with the scent of expensive cedar and the metallic tang of Ethan's ego. Ethan didn't look like a man who was about to shatter a woman's life. He looked like a man closing a mid-sized acquisition. With a practiced fluid motion, he reached into the breast pocket of his bespoke charcoal suit and pulled out a white envelope. He didn't hand it to me. He slid it across the marble, the paper making a soft, haunting hiss as it traveled toward my hands. I knew before I opened it that it was a buyout. He cleared his throat, his gaze drifting to his Patek Philippe, checking the time as if our 5 years together could be summarized in a 30-minute window before his next conference call. He told me to be realistic, his voice devoid of the warmth that used to whisper against my neck at night. He spoke about Chloe, a 24-year-old assistant who was as shallow as a puddle but as fresh as a new spring morning. He cited my age, 38, as if it were a terminal diagnosis, a biological clock that had ticked its last relevant second. He told me Chloe was pregnant with his heir and that he needed a fresher start, a clean slate. The $100,000 in the envelope was, in his words, a gesture of goodwill to ensure I could retire in silence and comfort. To him, I was a liability to be liquidated, a line item that needed to be balanced so he could move on to his next venture without the mess of an emotional audit. I didn't cry. My father always told me that tears were a waste of moisture in a negotiation, and as I watched Ethan, I noticed the subtle micro-expressions flitting across his face. There was a twitch of relief in his jaw and a slight softening of his shoulders. He thought he had won. He thought that by putting a price on my dignity, he had successfully purchased my disappearance. He saw a woman who was defeated by her own biological reality, but I saw a man who had just handed me the keys to his vault. I pulled a document from my own leather portfolio. I didn't reach for his standard boilerplate breakup waiver. Instead, I calmly placed a single sheet of paper on the table, a final consultation service receipt. My voice was as steady as a surgeon's hand as I explained that before I vanished, we needed to formalize the professional nature of our shared history. I told him that since I had managed his personal portfolios for years, this payment needed to be recorded correctly for tax purposes to avoid any future audits. Ethan, blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate burning need to be rid of me so he could return to his younger, more compliant mistress, barely glanced at the fine print. He laughed a short, mocking sound that felt like a slap and signed it with a flourish of his fountain pen. That signature was his undoing. By reclassifying that $100,000 as a professional fee, Rather than a personal gift or settlement, he had legally acknowledged that my intellectual property and proprietary management strategies were embedded in his current investment structures. He didn't realize he had just given me a permanent legal stake in his empire, a Trojan horse hidden in plain sight. He thought he was paying me to leave. In reality, he was paying me to stay woven into the very fabric of his wealth. He stood up, adjusted his tie, and walked out without a backward glance, leaving me alone with the check and the silence. Later that afternoon, the cold marble of the restaurant was replaced by the sterile white light of a high-end OB/GYN clinic on the Upper East Side. I sat in the hushed waiting room, my heart a rhythmic thrum against my ribs. When the doctor turned the monitor toward me, the world didn't tilt, it crystallized. There were two distinct flickers on the screen, two tiny heartbeats racing against the quiet of the room. I wasn't just pregnant, I was carrying twins. In that moment, the betrayal didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a calculation. I didn't see children through a lens of heartbreak or the desperate hope of a woman trying to save a dying relationship. I saw them through my professional lens. To the legal system of the elite, these were unreported heirs. They were trust contaminants that would throw Ethan's carefully guarded family succession into a state of absolute chaos. I knew exactly what Ethan would do if he found out. He would use his lawyers, his money, and his influence to neutralize the risk I posed. He would try to buy my womb the way he tried to buy my silence, or worse, he would attempt to take them from me to ensure his legacy was kept under his thumb. I made a choice right there under the humming fluorescent lights. I would offer him absolute silence, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to maintain total control over the timeline. I would let him believe he was a free man. I would let him plan his lavish wedding and his new life with Chloe while I moved my pieces into place. I wasn't hiding, I was repositioning. I was taking my variables and moving them to an offshore account where he could never touch them until the moment I decided to strike. I walked out of that clinic and toward the airport, leaving behind the woman who loved him and embracing the woman who would audit his soul. I didn't sign that paper because I was defeated. I signed it because I just became the only person who knows how much his empire is actually worth. As the wheels of the plane touched down, I felt the heavy, suffocating mantle of being Ethan's +1 fall away, replaced by the sharp, cold clarity of a woman who had ceased to exist in his world. I didn't just leave the United States. I performed a digital execution of my former self. I deactivated my social media accounts, changed my primary contact information to encrypted servers, and severed ties with every mutual acquaintance who might serve as a conduit for information. In the high-stakes game of narcissistic control, I knew that silence was the only weapon that couldn't be parried. Ethan expected a scene, a desperate phone call, a pleading email, or perhaps a bitter public outburst that he could use to paint me as the unstable ex-fiancé. By giving him nothing but a vacuum, I denied him the oxygen he needed to sustain his ego. To the gossiping circles of our old life, I was the woman who had lost everything and slunk away in shame. But in the sterile, secure quiet of my new apartment, I knew I was simply removing my pieces from a board he thought he controlled. My days soon fell into a rigorous clinical rhythm that mirrored the precision of the financial audits I once performed for the city's elite. From my sun-drenched desk overlooking the lake, I began the painstaking process of auditing Ethan's empire. I wasn't looking for sentimental remnants of our time together. I was hunting for the structural fractures he had ignored in his haste to replace me. With the eye of a seasoned wealth management advisor, I pored over years of digital records, tax filings, and the complex web of investment vehicles we had built side by side. I discovered that in his rush to marry Chloe and rebrand his life, Ethan had left a trail of logic errors that were staggering in their negligence. He had failed to officially revoke certain powers of attorney, and several of his primary trust structures contained sunset clauses that were nearing their expiration clauses I had drafted to protect us as a unit, but which now stood as ticking financial time bombs for a man standing alone. I saw the vague language he had used in recent filings to fast-track his new ventures, a symptom of his belief that he was above the mundane reality of procedure. Every sloppy signature and every overlooked compliance detail was a thread I carefully began to untangle, not for the sake of petty revenge, but to map the exact coordinates of his inevitable collapse. I treated his greed like a predictable market trend, knowing that the very traits that made him a predator, his arrogance and his impatience, were the same traits that had made him vulnerable to a meticulous patient auditor. While I dismantled his financial future, I guarded the biological one with a ferocity that surprised even me. My pregnancy with the twins was classified as high-risk, a fact that demanded a level of medical shielding that bordered on the clandestine. I sought out a private clinic that specialized in high-net-worth privacy, ensuring that my medical records were stored on a closed-circuit system far from the reach of the digital scrapers Ethan's firm used to vet potential liabilities. I viewed the twins' existence as the ultimate ghost variable, a truth that was documented with absolute legal accuracy for future inheritance claims, yet remained completely invisible to Ethan's network. I wasn't hiding them to be cruel. I was protecting them from being used as pawns in a narrative they didn't choose. I navigated the morning sickness and the growing weight of my body with the same stoicism I applied to my spreadsheets. Every ultrasound was a tactical update, every heartbeat a confirmation that my leverage was growing in secret. I was building a case not just for myself, but for the 2 lives that Ethan had already discarded without even knowing they existed. This wasn't about using children as weapons in a divorce-style battle. It was about ensuring that when the time came for the truth to be disclosed, it would enter the system with the force of an unarguable fact, leaving Ethan no room to negotiate or destroy. The isolation was a luxury I hadn't realized I could afford. Without the constant noise of Ethan's demands or the pressure to perform for a social circle that only valued me for my proximity to power, my mind became a razor. I spent my evenings watching the lights of the town flicker across the water, feeling the subtle movements of the twins, and knowing that every day of silence was another day. Ethan spent growing more complacent, more convinced of his own invincibility. He was likely laughing over expensive dinners, bragging about how easily he had handled the Sarah problem with a $100,000 check. He didn't realize that in the world of wealth management, the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting, it's the one who is quietly checking the fine print while everyone else is celebrating. I was no longer a victim of his betrayal. I was the architect of his audit. I was waiting for the perfect alignment of fiscal quarters and legal deadlines, the moment when his new life would be at its most fragile and my ghost variables would be ready to materialize. The vacuum I had created around him was starting to pull at the edges of his empire, a silent pressure that he was too arrogant to even notice yet. They thought my disappearance was a sign of weakness. In reality, it was the only way to ensure they never saw the storm coming. The storm I was brewing remained invisible to the naked eye, even as the world I once inhabited began to garishly announce its new order. From my quiet vantage point in Switzerland, I watched via curated news alerts as Ethan's public rebrand reached its fever pitch. The announcement of his engagement to Chloe was orchestrated with the clinical precision of a product launch. In the glossy pages of society journals, our 5-year partnership was efficiently liquidated, replaced by a narrative of unexpected soulmates and new beginnings. The social circle we had cultivated together, people I had advised on their portfolios and hosted in my home, proved to have the memory of a goldfish. They rewrote history overnight, treating me like a forgotten relic or a temporary glitch in Ethan's otherwise flawless trajectory. I felt no jealousy as I looked at the photos of Chloe, radiant and youthful in gowns that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Instead, I felt a profound sense of pity for her. To Ethan, she wasn't a partner. She was a bio-placeholder, a younger, more malleable vessel for the heir he so desperately craved to solidify his legacy. My age had been a liability to his ego, but her youth was an asset he intended to exploit. For a man like Ethan, people were never truly loved. They were merely audited for their current market value, and Chloe had no idea that her stock would eventually plummet, just as mine supposedly had. However, I had no intention of letting her remain in the dark. While Ethan was busy parading her through ballrooms, I decided to send a very specific kind of wedding gift. I didn't send a warning about his infidelity or a bitter letter detailing his cruelty. Those are the weapons of the heartbroken, and I was far beyond that. Instead, I sent an anonymous financial protection kit to her private residence disguised as a high-end bridal consultation package. Inside was a meticulously curated guide on prenuptial autonomy and the legal intricacies of separate property states. It was a masterclass in financial self-defense, stripped of emotion and loaded with cold, hard facts. I knew Chloe was young, but she wasn't stupid, just inexperienced. By providing her with the vocabulary of ownership, I was seeding a rebellion inside the one place Ethan felt most secure, his own home. I wanted her to start asking the questions he hated most, questions about title deeds, joint accounts, and the proof of her own stake in his empire. I knew that the moment she stopped being a compliant fan and started acting like an informed partner, Ethan's irritation would flare. I was giving her the tools to build her own fortress, knowing that every brick she laid would be a thorn in his side, turning his fresh start into a domestic battlefield of transparency and accountability. While Chloe was learning how to protect herself, I was busy ensuring that the system Ethan thought he owned was preparing to reject him. The true beauty of my strategy lay in the automated nature of global finance. Ethan's lavish new lifestyle, the sprawling estate for Chloe, and the upcoming wedding required a massive infusion of capital, which he planned to draw from his family's primary trust. What he didn't realize was that I had already moved the ghost variable into the light. I had officially registered the twins' existence in the Global Compliance and Inheritance Registries, a process that was legally required but often overlooked until an audit occurred. Because this trust was governed by strict transparency laws designed to prevent tax evasion, every potential heir, including unborn ones, had to be disclosed for any significant withdrawal to be approved. Ethan, in his arrogant ignorance, had failed to report the existence of my pregnancy to his bank, likely believing it was a private matter he had already paid off. Consequently, when his lawyer submitted the paperwork for his multi-million-dollar withdrawal, it didn't just pass through, it hit a wall. To the bank's automated compliance software, an undisclosed heir isn't a family secret. It's a red flag for fraud and trust contamination. The beauty of a system-driven collapse is that it requires no shouting. Ethan was likely sitting in his mahogany-paneled office, baffled as to why his gold-plated requests were being returned with the status of pending further clarification. He was used to commanding people, but he couldn't command an algorithm that had been programmed to flag inconsistencies. The bank didn't call him to accuse him of anything. They simply froze the movement of funds until the heir discrepancy was resolved. He was suddenly a man with a king's appetite but a frozen treasury. He was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare of his own making, forced to explain his life to faceless compliance officers who didn't care about his charisma or his Patek Philippe. Every day the funds were held was a day his reputation among his contractors and his future bride began to fray. He thought he had replaced me with a version of womanhood that would be easier to control, a blank slate he could write his own rules upon. He was so busy congratulating himself on his cleverness that he failed to notice the shift in the atmosphere. He was losing his grip on the narrative, and the very woman he brought in to bolster his ego was starting to look at him with a gaze that was far too sharp for his comfort. He didn't realize that the woman he replaced me with was no longer his biggest fan. She was now my most curious student. The digital silence I had maintained from Switzerland was soon echoed by the silence of the global financial system as it began to close its gates on Ethan. In the high-stakes world of international capital, a man's reputation is only as good as his compliance record, and Ethan's record had just been hit by a ghost in the machine. I watched through my secure professional portals as his most ambitious project, a $100 million real estate acquisition in the Hamptons, suddenly ground to a halt. It wasn't a scandal or a lawsuit that stopped it. It was something far more sterile and harder to fight, a pending status. The bank's automated compliance software had flagged his withdrawal request with a chillingly vague notification. His lawyers were told that further clarification on potential heirs was required before any major movement of trust assets could be authorized. For a man like Ethan, who was used to snapping his fingers and seeing mountains move, this bureaucratic wall was maddening. He tried to bully the junior associates and bribe the senior partners, but for the first time in his life, he found himself trapped by the very impersonal, cold-blooded system he had once used to discard me. The algorithms didn't care about his charisma or his lineage. They only saw a data discrepancy that smelled like fraud, and they wouldn't budge until every variable was accounted for. The irony of his situation was a perfect mirror of the humiliation he had handed me across that marble table. In a delicious reversal of roles, it was now Ethan who was forced to wait for answers that never came. He was the one sitting in mahogany-lined waiting rooms checking his watch with increasing desperation as doors remained closed to him. Because his primary trust was under review, his personal credit lines were restricted as a standard risk mitigation procedure. The man who had once belittled me by sliding a $100,000 check across a table was now being asked for upfront cash by his own wedding planners and caterers. They had heard the whispers, the subtle shifts in credit ratings that circulate like wildfire in elite circles, and they were no longer willing to bank on his name alone. I imagined him standing in his designer kitchen, red-faced and sweating, as a florist politely informed him that their $50,000 deposit hadn't cleared. The wealth he had used as a weapon to make me feel small and replaceable was now completely out of his reach, locked away in a vault of his own making. He was being treated like a financial liability, a high-risk entity whose presence was suddenly toxic to the very institutions that had once bowed to him. The audience of his peers who had so quickly rewritten history to include Chloe now began to look at him with a different kind of curiosity, the kind you reserve for a sinking ship. As his world tightened, my name began to reappear in his life like a persistent haunting. It didn't happen through a dramatic confrontation or a tearful phone call. It happened through the footnotes of the very legal battles he was fighting to reclaim his liquidity. As the compliance audit deepened, the investigators discovered that several of the investment vehicles Ethan was trying to liquidate were still technically tied to the final consultation service receipt he had signed so carelessly in Part 1. My professional signature wasn't just a relic of our past. It was a mandatory requirement for the verification of intellectual property that underpinned his portfolios. The bank's lawyers realized that they couldn't certify the purity of his assets without a formal sign-off from the person who had managed them, me. I became the necessary party in every boardroom meeting and every legal filing. Ethan, who thought he had deleted me with a single payment, realized with a cold shock that he couldn't take a single step into his new life with Chloe until he addressed the woman he had tried to erase. He was a king with no gold trapped in a palace whose locks only I had the keys to turn. Every attempt he made to bypass the system only triggered more security protocols. He tried to have his lawyers argue that I was a disgruntled former employee, but the service receipt he had signed proved I was a high-level consultant whose work was integral to his holdings. He had walked right into the trap of his own arrogance. He had been so eager to show me how little I mattered that he had signed the very document that made me essential. I watched the flurry of legal activity from the quiet of my study, feeling the twins kick as if they too were aware of the shifting tides. There was a profound, quiet satisfaction in knowing that while he was shouting at his legal team and promising Chloe that everything would be fine, the machinery of the world was simply doing exactly what I had designed it to do. I didn't need to scream or beg for justice. I had simply moved a few decimal points in the ledger of his life and waited for the audit to catch up. He had treated our relationship like a transaction, so I had turned our breakup into a compliance nightmare. The man who thought he could define my value was now discovering that without my approval, his own value was exactly zero. I didn't have to sue him. I simply let his own greed trigger the security locks on his kingdom. The rhythmic clicking of the compliance locks on Ethan's empire was a sound only I could hear, but the silence it produced was loud enough to drive a man like him to the brink of insanity. As his liquidity dried up and his prestigious deals turned into stagnant piles of paperwork, the polished mask of the untouchable executive finally began to crack. The vacuum I had created around him, the total absence of my voice, my presence, and my cooperation, was finally more than his ego could bear. It started with a flurry of emails, then escalated to voicemails that grew increasingly erratic as the days passed. Ethan, the man who had forced me to sign a non-disclosure agreement with the cold detachment of a hangman, was now the one frantically breaking it. He called me at 3 in the morning, his voice thick with a mixture of whiskey and desperation, swinging wildly between threats of legal ruin and pathetic pleas for me to fix the mess I had made. He accused me of sabotage, of being a bitter woman who couldn't let go, and then in the same breath he would beg me to remember our 5 years together and help him unlock the trust accounts. To a younger version of me, these calls might have been heartbreaking, but to the woman I was now, they were merely data points in his psychological unraveling. I didn't engage with his anger, and I certainly didn't respond to his charms. I maintained a level of discipline that was absolute, a fortress of professional indifference. Every time he reached out, I didn't answer. Instead, I forwarded the recordings and the screenshots to my attorney, who issued a single, devastatingly brief response on my behalf. Please refer to the professional services agreement of our last meeting. This was the ultimate win, a victory built on the realization that a toxic man's greatest fear is a woman who no longer needs to be heard. By refusing to enter the mud with him, I stayed on the high ground, watching him drown in the very silence he had tried to buy. As Ethan's financial walls continued to close in the air inside his new life with Chloe became unbreathable. She was young, yes, but she wasn't blind to the sudden shift in the winds. Chloe had been sold a dream of effortless wealth and social elevation, but the reality she woke up to was one of frozen credit cards and hushed, panicked phone calls with lawyers. The final blow came when she discovered the true nature of the discrepancy the bank was investigating. Whether it was through a slip of Ethan's tongue during a drunken rage or the financial protection kit I had sent her finally hitting home, Chloe realized that Ethan had hidden the existence of potential heirs, my twins, from her and from the system. She saw that his empire wasn't a solid foundation for her future, but a crumbling ruin built on lies and undisclosed liabilities. She realized that if Ethan could discard a woman who had built his wealth for 5 years, he would do the same to her the moment her youth was no longer enough to distract him from his problems. Chloe's departure wasn't the dramatic hair-pulling catfight the tabloids might have hoped for. It was a cold, pragmatic exit. She saw that she had no standing, no protection, and no real value in Ethan's eyes beyond her role as a bio placeholder. Ironically, she realized that the woman she had replaced, was the only person in Ethan's entire circle who had ever actually understood how to protect the partners in his life. She left him in the middle of the week, taking her designer bags and the hollow promises he had given her, leaving him alone in an estate he could no longer afford to maintain. The collapse of their relationship was quickly followed by the public death of his reputation. There was no explosive scandal, no front-page headline detailing his infidelities or his financial woes. In the world of the ultra-wealthy, the end comes quietly with a polite press release. The wedding of the century was officially and indefinitely postponed due to unforeseen personal circumstances. In the high society of New York, an indefinite postponement is a death sentence. It is the polite way of saying the money has run out or the skeletons have climbed out of the closet. Rumors of financial instability and undisclosed legal liabilities began to circulate through the boardrooms and country clubs like a slow-acting poison. The very people who had been so quick to embrace Chloe and forget my name now began to distance themselves from Ethan as if his misfortune were contagious. He was no longer the golden boy of the investment world. He was a liability, a man whose personal life had contaminated his professional credibility to the point of no return. His board of directors, once his most loyal sycophants, began to discuss succession planning and reputational management. Ethan had built his entire identity on the perception of power and the control of the narrative, but now the narrative was being written by the compliance officers and the gossip columnists, and he was the villain of the piece. He was losing everything he valued: his status, his influence, and his access to the circles that had once defined him. I watched all of this from across the ocean, the weight of the twins now a heavy, comforting presence that reminded me of why I had fought so hard for this quiet victory. I received a final frantic email from Ethan sent from his personal account after his corporate access had been restricted. It wasn't a threat this time, just a broken, rambling question. How much do you want to make this go away? He still thought he was in a transaction. He still believed that every person and every problem had a price tag that could be settled with a signature. He didn't understand that he had already paid the price the day he pushed that envelope across the table at me. He had traded a partner for a mistress loyalty for youth and a legacy for a momentary ego boost. Now he was sitting in the wreckage of his own making, realizing that the system he had manipulated for so long had finally turned its cold, unblinking eyes on him. He was discovering that in the world of wealth management, you can lose your money and recover, but once you lose the trust of the system, you are truly bankrupt. I didn't reply to his email. I didn't need to. The silence I had cultivated was now a permanent feature of his life, a void that no amount of money could ever fill. He thought he could buy my silence for $100,000. Now he's discovering that the cost of my voice is everything he has left. The chaos of Ethan's unraveling felt like a distant, fading echo as I transitioned into a world defined by a much softer rhythm. In the pristine, quiet halls of a private clinic in Zurich, the turbulence of the last year finally gave way to a profound sense of arrival. I gave birth to 2 healthy, beautiful twins, a boy and a girl, whose first cries seemed to sweep away the last remnants of the humiliation Ethan had tried to drown me in. I sat in a chair by the window, the alpine sun warming the room, holding these 2 tiny lives that the world's most powerful compliance systems had spent months protecting. There was no desperate call to Ethan, no filing for child support, and no demand for him to acknowledge his flesh and blood. I didn't need his permission, and I certainly didn't need his money. By correcting the trust errors and ensuring the twins were registered as heirs within the global compliance framework, I had already secured their future with a fortress of legal protections that Ethan couldn't dismantle even if he tried. My life was now one of luxury, yes, but it was a luxury of the spirit, a peace that came from being entirely unburdened by a man who had once tried to put a price on my soul. I was living well, not as an act of defiance, but as a natural consequence of my own self-worth. Every morning I spent with my children in our garden was a testament to the fact that the best revenge isn't a loud explosion. It is the quiet, undeniable evidence that you are thriving in the very space someone tried to leave empty. The anniversary of our final meeting at that marble table arrived on a crisp, clear Tuesday. To Ethan, that date likely represented the beginning of his descent, but to me, it was the day I finally closed the ledger on our past. I sat at my desk and wrote a check for exactly $115,000. The $100,000 was the principal he had slid across the table in that white envelope, and the $15,000 was the 15% interest, a fair market rate for the investment he had unknowingly made in my professional independence. I placed the check in an envelope and wrote a single razor-sharp memo at the bottom. Refund for services rendered. My advice, invest in a better lawyer next time. By returning that money, I performed a retroactive execution of his power over me. He could no longer tell himself or his dwindling circle of sycophants that he had paid me off, or that he had handled the Sarah problem with a generous settlement. I was returning his bribe with interest, effectively erasing the only transaction that made him feel superior. I was telling him that his wealth was insufficient, his price was too low, and his influence was non-existent. I imagined him receiving that envelope in his diminished office, realizing that the woman he thought he had bought and sold had just become his most expensive mistake. The check was a declaration that I was no longer an asset in his portfolio. I was the auditor who had found him bankrupt. Looking back, I realized that the most important lesson I learned wasn't about finance or law, but about the true nature of power. To the women who have watched this journey, those of you who have spent decades building lives only to be told you are suddenly expired or replaceable, I want you to understand one thing. Power isn't about winning a shouting match or being the loudest person in the room. It isn't about the drama of a public confrontation or the satisfaction of a catfight victory. Real power is the quiet, steady understanding of the rules of the game. It is the discipline to stay silent when your heart is screaming and the wisdom to move your pieces when the world thinks you've already left the board. Ethan tried to use my age as a weapon, thinking that 38 was the end of my relevance. He tried to use his wealth as a shield, thinking that $100,000 was enough to silence the truth. But he forgot that a woman who has spent her life managing the wealth of others knows exactly where the bodies are buried and which signatures actually matter. I didn't use my children as weapons in a petty war of hearts. I didn't have to. I simply weaponized the very truth that Ethan tried to erase, letting the system he worshipped become the instrument of his own undoing. I stood my ground not by fighting him, but by being so technically and morally correct that the world had no choice but to side with me. Now, as I stand on my terrace with my twins looking toward a future that I designed with my own hands and my own intellect, I feel a sense of completion that no marriage or partnership could ever provide. I am no longer defined by who I am to a man, but by who I am to myself and my children. Ethan's empire may be in ruins, his reputation a cautionary tale whispered in the clubs he once frequented, but that is merely a byproduct of his own choices. My victory isn't in his downfall, it is in my total and absolute independence. I have my name, I have my children, and I have a career that has never been more respected. I have built a kingdom of my own, one where loyalty is a requirement and transparency is the law. For every woman who has ever felt devalued or discarded, know that your worth is not a number that can be negotiated. It is an intrinsic value that increases every time you refuse to settle for less than you deserve. I didn't just survive the transaction Ethan tried to force upon me. I took the expired asset he thought I was and turned it into the most profitable venture of my life. I didn't just survive his attempt to erase me. I audited his soul and found it wasn't worth the investment. If you felt a surge of triumph as Sarah reclaimed her power, make sure to subscribe to our channel and join a community that values strength, intelligence, and the ultimate payoff of justice. We want to hear from you in the comments below. Do you believe Sarah's elegant revenge was the perfect response? Or should she have taken even more from Ethan? Many of our viewers have shared that this story reminds them of their own resilience, and your insights help us continue to bring these powerful narratives to life. Perhaps you have faced a moment where someone tried to devalue you only to realize they underestimated the brilliance of a woman who knows her worth. By subscribing, you ensure you never miss a masterclass in turning betrayal into a strategic victory. Your engagement drives this channel, and every like or comment is a testament to the fact that we don't just watch these stories, we learn from them. Let us know if you think Ethan got what he deserved, or if the interest on the insult was the most satisfying twist of all. Stay tuned for more stories of quiet strength and irreversible ends. We can't wait to read your thoughts and continue this journey together.